Yep, I watched Barbie. This is the Barbenheimer weekend where we have Barbie and Oppenheimer. July 22nd, 2023. What did I think of Barbie? Oh man, let's talk about that coming up next. The marketing for Barbie has been off the charts. It's penetrated into people in my social circle who usually know nothing about new releases. A lot of people I know want to go see this movie. Directed by Greta Gerwig, who did Little Women. Her husband Noah Baumbach's involved in the production as well. I made a video on his movie, The Squid and the Whale. I love some of his movies, so this was part of the reason I'm interested in going to see Barbie. Now, of course, Barbie is like this classic American toy, the idealized woman in a doll-shaped form. Here she's played by Margot Robbie. The movie starts out, and I'm going to try to just describe this movie without judging it too much here. The movie starts out in Barbie land, an idealized Barbie toy world, in which Barbie wakes up, everything's perfect, women rule the world, Ken lives to serve her, all the Kens live to serve her. In fact, all the women are Barbies, all the men are Kens. But a problem happens. Barbie starts getting, well, a bunch of existential crises. She thinks about death, and she gets flat feet, and then there's the threat of getting cellulite. Yep, that's the first act, and so then she enters the real world with Ken hopping along, trying to find the person or the girl who owns her for whatever reason. Then you have this interesting movie contrast between the idealized toy Barbie and her world versus the so-called real world. And of course, when she enters the real world, what happens to her? She gets aggressively hit on and sexually harassed repeatedly within the first 5 minutes of being there. Meanwhile, in the real world, Ken, who lives to serve Barbie, as I said, learns about patriarchy and masculinity, and he gets all these wild ideas about what a real man should be. He takes them back to Barbie land and turns the whole thing into a patriarchy, basically turns all the Barbies into winches, and all the Kens dominate, and the masculine aesthetic is everywhere. Barbie ends up going back to Barbie land with a woman who is her owner or something like that, and she gets distraught because it's a patriarchy. So what's a comedy to do but try to restore Barbie land and get rid of this evil invasion, this patriarchy thing, and go back to its old ways or maybe something new. On top of all that, you have the representation of Mattel in the real world, the toy corporation, led by a bunch of male CEOs in suits, and Will Ferrell plays the CEO of Mattel, and they're out to put Barbie back in her box, the stereotypical Barbie that Margot Robbie plays, and make her just as she was. So they try to go pursue her, and they go into Barbie land to try to get her. Now, the movie is really about types, stereotypes, ideas. It does feel to me like ideologues wrote a movie instead of storytellers. In fact, a lot of this movie is ideology. You'll hear the word patriarchy at least 15 times in this movie, and how it's bad and evil, and Barbie and the Barbies have to overcome it. Ken is played by Ryan Gosling. He really hams it up here. There are a couple Busby Berkeley-like musical numbers. He gets a lot of screen time. I found it to be a little bit too goofy for me, but then again, they're trying to do a toy-like world. One of my mild complaints about basically all the Marvel movies, the first Avengers movie, when I watched it, I was like, well, this is like me playing with toys when I was a 6-year-old kid in my room. This movie, parts of it at least, even though it's ideological, feel like, okay, this is a female Barbie world. And it's really toy-based and colorized that way. I did like some of the Barbie land sets and costumes, and I kind of like the way they did that, at least. But the movie couldn't stop sort of tripping it over itself to be meta, to analyze itself, to deal with ideological issues. This movie watches to me like someone took a college class on the Frankfurt School, read a bunch of articles about Adorno and Benjamin, and then took a class on evolutionary psychology, and then they were so confused, they're trying to figure out how the two work together, or maybe they don't. Meanwhile, they have a love of Barbie, but then they're worried about this false idealized image of Barbie. There's one scene where a bunch of middle school girls who are upset call Barbie a fascist. They actually label her like she sexualized capitalism, and yet this movie reaffirms capitalism, like Mattel, over and over again. I couldn't count how many times they said the word Mattel. I mean, my notes say 35 times I saw or heard that word. I haven't heard that word that many times in my last 30 years of my life, and here in the last 2 hours I heard it 30 some times. I haven't seen the copyright restricted sign put in a movie so many times as it's in this movie. So the giant question is this movie about ideas that are going to transform the world and making the world more feminized than it is, or more open to feminism, whatever kind of feminism this movie is offering? Or is this movie about selling products? I feel like there's not just a tension, but probably contradiction between those two. I think a lot of people will feel that way. An example of that, in fact, is they cast Margot Robbie, as I said, as Barbie. And then in the middle of the movie, a voiceover narrator apologizes for them casting Margot Robbie. But nevertheless, throughout the entire movie, you get here, I think she's a stunningly beautiful woman. Her beautiful face thrown all over the movie as an image to live up to. An idealized version of a female type. And yet they're trying to undercut that sometimes with the dialogue in the movie. So I do think the way I watched it was sort of the evolutionary psychology stuff won out. Visually, it dominated, and the capitalism stuff dominated over and against sort of the cultural Marxism that has in the movie, like dumbed down cultural Marxism. I know for a fact, well, I bet my life savings on Adorno and Benjamin absolutely hating this movie, all the Frankfurt School guys hating it, but nevertheless, so the distillation of their ideas are talked about here. And yet, in the end, what wins is like Barbie is cute, buy the toy. It's never going to escape these commercial product movies. I say that with this contextual knowledge, Mattel is making 45 movies. Unbelievable. About all of their products. And this is the one that's kicking it off. And throughout this movie, you'll see clothes thrown on the screen and then labels put on the clothes, costumes for Barbie, that I suppose you can either buy or at least celebrate yourself. And so I do wonder, what is the purpose of this movie? If there's a political message here, the one I got from it is that Barbie has become diverse and accepting of a bunch of stuff, but it's not diverse and accepting enough. And in the end, Barbie has to learn to accept to be human rather than idealized. What human means, in fact, is thinking about death and the prospect of death. I thought they were pretty flippant with that. And it's a chief sin in my book to have a character have an existential crisis, thinking about death, what death might mean, the consequences of that, why do I exist sorts of questions. But then kind of put it to the side or be flippant about it. In the end, they tried to redeem that question, but I still felt like they were really cheap with it. And for that reason, I read this more as a commercial movie that actually reaffirms some of the basics about Barbie. Girls need to play with dolls. Girls need to play with cute dolls, become cute, become feminine in various kinds of ways. And Barbie can still be an ideal of that. I feel like that's at the end of this movie still. But I think this movie is a perception test. I think people will come to it and read 1,000 different things in it, given their own particular perceptions. It's going to be a hard movie to pin down because there's so many different kinds of things in it, declarations in it, and ideas. That's why I say evolutionary psychology and a Frankfurt School, and maybe a little bit of philosophy 101 kind of mixed together, and there's just a confused grab bag of that. One test that I have for myself is, do I feel smarter or stupider after I watch the movie? Knowing enough about the stuff in the movie, I feel a little bit stupider after Barbie, so I can only give it 2 stars. I think a lot of people bringing their kids to this may not appreciate it that much. It's not like Barbie is going off on adventures and developing her character. This is a meta-analysis of Barbie as a cultural product, a cultural object that has lots of meanings and ideals, and whether those ideals are just and fair or not. There's all that's kind of, really the focus is on that quite often. But along with selling the product, and Mattel definitely dominates this movie. I don't care if they're the bad guys. That to me is overwhelmed by the fact that they're mentioned so many times. And Will Ferrell, who's too goofy to be evil, is the head of them. I think Mattel comes out a winner in this movie. People will remember their name. Well, so much for the Barbenheimer stuff. I reviewed Oppenheimer. You can check that out. What do you think of Barbie? Let us know in the comments. Oh, and by the way, Greta Gerwig, I must say this. There was a whole post on Letterboxd and other places, Criterion Collection, about the influences. And she had Umbrellas of Cherbourg and The Red Shoes. Those movies that she's inspired by were really inspired by great thinking, great philosophy, great literature, the great questions of life. I did not see that. I thought this movie dumbed all that stuff down. So you need to return to The Red Shoes. Go watch that by Michael Powell if you really want something to chew on. Wings of Desire by Wim Wenders.